Okay, so we're going to do section 3, some of the homework, and let's see. I think we're going to go ahead and start with chapter 20. So we'll go into the Mind tab. We'll click on chapter 20, and as we've been doing, scroll down to homework, and then the ones that say counts toward grade. So we'll click on problems and applications, and let's open that up. So let's see, we have about 8 questions, I think, there. Okay, so we'll go ahead, we'll start. So I'm going to click on the first question. And so as you can see, these topics are on aggregate supply and aggregate demand. And I just want to quickly remind you of a couple things before we even start. The long run aggregate supply curve. So if you look at the diagram here, the straight line, the one that's vertical, represents the quantity Q star, or that's what we've been calling it in class. It's our potential output level. So it's the idea of the maximum amount that we can produce in our economy given the technology and resources available to us. But always keep in mind that we always allow for a certain amount of unemployment. So the long run aggregate supply curve is allowing for, remember, the 2 kinds of unemployment, the frictional and the structural. Then we have our short-run aggregate supply curve, which represents whatever the time frame is, and we don't qualify. It's just this period of time where our nominal wages are not changing. So wages are set at some level, and then if for some reason they change, then we would have a whole new, different short-run aggregate supply curve. Keep in mind that the long-run aggregate supply curve has no connection to the price level because in the long run, all adjustments have been made. So it's a key distinction between long run and short run. And then we have our aggregate demand curve, which, again, quick reminder, represents the demand for all goods and services. So remember, we have the consumer consumes, the firm invests, the government spends, and then we have our net exports, so exports minus imports. So that's a quick reminder of aggregate demand and supply. So let's start with the questions. So it says, remember, always read these questions at least twice. Suppose the economy is in a long-run equilibrium. So they're saying, okay, we're starting right here. We're in long run. So that's good. We're in long run. And then suddenly it says firms become pessimistic about future business conditions and decide to cut back on investment spending. And they tell you right there, they actually tell you it results in a fall in aggregate demand, which hopefully should make sense to you because, as I say, aggregate demand represents consumption, investment, government spending plus net exports, exports minus imports. So if we have a decrease in our investment, what do you think is going to happen here? Well, our aggregate demand curve, I'm going to just do this one, is going to decrease or shift to the left. And then you're asked a couple, actually you're only asked the one question, what will happen as a result of this change to the unemployment rate? And I think you'll be able to answer this. Okay, so let's continue on to question number 2. All right, so question number 2 is asking which of the following events will increase, decrease, or have no effect on the long-run aggregate supply curve. So what you want to think about here is basically what's going to impact our long-run output production level. So if you look at all of these, I'm just going to tell you right now, every single one of these things could impact the long-run aggregate supply. I'll pick out this one. Congress limits the work week to 40 hours. As a little note, I may or may not have mentioned this in class, but when we do draw the long-run aggregate supply curve, it also inherent in it is that we're assuming people work 40-hour weeks. So there's a reason why we can always go beyond our Q star, and one of the reasons is because we would have lower than the unemployment that we deem as acceptable, Remember the frictional plus structural. And the other reason would be is where we're having people work more than 40 hours. So I think you'll be able to do these. So we'll continue on. Okay, question number 3 here says, suppose an economy is in a long-run equilibrium. So we start off in long-run equilibrium, and the central bank reduces the money supply by 5%. So quick reminder, we haven't quite done this at this moment, but the money supply is the amount of money available for spending. So if we take out the amount of money available for spending in the economy, what that tends to do is it will cause spending to decline. And so in this picture, the spending, remember, is reflected by our aggregate demand curve. So just go ahead and I think you just shift the aggregate demand curve in the direction that you think it will have impact. And I think you'll be all right with this one. And we'll continue on. Okay, this question number 4 is, I'll just read it. It says, in 1939, with the U.S. economy not yet fully recovered from the Great Depression, President Roosevelt proclaimed that Thanksgiving would fall a week earlier than usual so that the shopping period before Christmas would be longer. So what this question is trying to ask you is what is going to happen? Which one of these graphs here would represent that picture? Would it be graph A or would it be graph B? So again, read the question again. So it says in 1939, the economy hadn't recovered from the Great Depression. Well, hadn't quite fully recovered or qualified. So President Roosevelt proclaimed that Thanksgiving would fall a week earlier. So what we're trying to demonstrate here is where were we during that period of time? So if you go back, remember there are 2 kinds of GDP gaps. There's an inflationary gap and there's a deflationary gap or a recessionary gap. So he wanted the economy during the Great Depression was not fully recovered. So which one do you think that is? And then with that thought in mind, which one represents that type of gap? So quick reminder, if your equilibrium is to the right of your Q star, which is what's happening here, you've gone beyond. So that's inflationary. And this one is where if your equilibrium, your short-run supply and demand are over here, and your long-run Q stars over here, we're below where we would like to be. That's our deflationary gap. So I think you'll be able to kind of do this one. It's a good practice question. Okay, question number 5 says, whenever the economy enters a recession, its long-run supply curve shifts to the left. So take a moment to think about that. Remember, our long-run supply represents our Q star. It's our potential. So it is what it is. So keep that in mind when you answer this one. And then we'll continue on. Okay, so this question reads, for each of the following events, use the subsequent graph to illustrate the short-run effect on either aggregate supply and or aggregate demand. So the first one says, so it's just one, we'll just do one thing at a time. So households spend more in response to a tax cut. So what you want to ask yourself is, number 1, this is spending. So spending is going to be something to do with demand. So that's the first thing you got to figure out, is what they're saying to do with aggregate demand or aggregate supply, short or long run. So if it's households decide to spend more because they get a tax cut, what's going to happen to aggregate demand? Okay, I think you can do that. The second one says, the price of crude oil decreases. Well, that's a cost of production. So what you want to keep in mind here is what happens when costs of production change in the short run. So keep that in mind when you do that. Okay, this question, be careful with this. It says a wave of immigration significantly increases the population. So if we go back to the question, what it was asking, it was saying short run effects. So, a wave of immigration increasing the population could ultimately, over time, cause a potential output to change. But this set of questions is asking about short run. So I'm just going to tell you, don't be shifting the long run supply. So if more people come to this country, we could have impact on aggregate supply in short run, because that could be an increase in output. And if there's more people purchasing things, what do you think is going to happen to aggregate demand? So I think you should be able to kind of do that one now with that little hint. Okay, let's see this question. So this question says, suppose firms become very pessimistic about future business conditions and significantly reduce spending. What is going to happen to this picture is basically what it's going to ask. So the short run effect of this pessimism, we've done this on the prior question, what's going to happen to spending overall, to aggregate demand? And then the next set of questions, I actually think you should be able to do this without my assistance.